I was recently asked how to reassemble the intake manifold on a Mark V BPY FSI. That's a 2-liter turbo motor. It's found in the Golfs, the Jennas, whatever. Just the general 2-liter turbo motor that comes on the Volkswagen A5 chassis. So, I want to show you guys what is involved in that. With any sort of intake manifold replacement, you want to make sure that you also replace the intake manifold gasket, which is what I'm cleaning off now. You can sometimes get away with reusing it, but more often than not, you should replace it. It's just good preventative maintenance because it can be a cause of stumbles and misfires, just like the carbon can. So what I had it all for is a carbon cleaning. You can also access the thermostat from here, as well as replace that brittle PCV hose that runs from the oil filter housing to the PCV system. I replaced it with a 1-inch piece of heater hose, but you should use about 1 1/4. If you have a stock PCV, plastic PCV, you should not use a 1-inch because it will crack. It'll crack everything. So because I had a BSH plate on here, I was able to stretch it out. Also, you want to make sure you check your cam follower. Make sure that the LC coating is nice and there's no excessive wear on the cam follower itself or inside the cam chain housing, which is this whole unit here. Often that gasket also needs to be replaced, so that's a good thing to do while you're here. So anyway, it's held on by 7 of these 67 or 68 millimeter bolts. There are 5 along the top, 2 in the bottom, and then there are a few. There's 2 actually, one on either side, 6 millimeter or 10 millimeter 6x1 threaded nuts that go on either stud on either side. So without further ado, I'll show you guys how to replace it. Oh, also there is this bullshit post, which is, I'm sure if you're disassembling it, that you've run into, that needs the triple square. So I went ahead and I'm just leaving this out. It's here for support, but I mean, I've run this thing without one for probably close to 80,000 miles with no issue. So first thing you want to do is dip your finger in some oil, run it in the 4 ports for the injectors in the fuel rail. It's also important to note that when you're replacing this, you take a look at the injectors themselves, make sure none pulled out of the head or out of the block. If they did, then you'll need to go ahead and replace the O-rings and use a injector seal rebuild kit. They're about 15 bucks from Volkswagen, or I'm sure you can get them from ECS or wherever else. Make sure the O-rings are intact. You'll also want to lube them up with some oil. If there are any tears, again, you'll need to replace them with the rebuild kit. Or if they stick in here, that means they're weak enough to pull off, which means you should also replace them with an injector rebuild kit. I leave my high pressure fuel pump on. Some people may take it off, but whatever. Another step I like to take is to preload the bolts into the manifold itself. Now there are 2 smaller bolts in the 2nd and 4th slot along the top. Those bolts are actually to hold the bracket on for the fuel rail itself. So if you take those off, it'll probably move around and not give you a fun time when reinstalling. On the bottom, there are 1 and 2. The 2nd bolt you'll have to position accordingly behind the hard line so you're able to get it in easily. So once you get that done, make sure everything's good to go. You'll need to replace the harness or reinstall the harness for the fuel line, so keep that in mind over here. There's also the intake flat motor harness over here, but we'll install that later. So just keep that one out of the way for now. So put it in place, and you'll actually use the leftmost stud for a guide. So put that in and pull it out just enough for both of them to go on. Pull the check valve out of the way and make sure that makes a nice seal. We'll pull this out a little bit. I should have actually done that before putting it on. So I'll pull this out a little bit again. And I'll put the fuel rail harness back on. Make sure that's nice, tight. Put that back on. There we go. The torque specs, I'll try to link them in the comments if I can find them, but they're relatively low. Don't over torque them, and make sure you torque them in a star pattern. Otherwise, you're going to run into some issues You're also not going to want to torque them all the way right away, so keep that in mind too. So once they're in there, just a little bit. The hardest part, I think, are the nuts to reinstall. So I take a 6-inch extension with a 10 millimeter 3/8. There we go. 3/8 socket. I put it on, and I take a small piece of masking tape, and I put it along the socket itself. So this will keep the bolt from, or the nut from actually falling out, and still allow it to thread. So we'll take that and we will put it on an impact, which normally I'd say don't start bolts with an impact, but these things are a real pain in the ass. So go ahead and use, this is a guide. You might need a flashlight. I should be putting this on my head, but you know, once you can get it on there. Of course not. No problem. Sometimes you may need to work it up if it gets stuck or whatever. This is probably the most pain in the ass part of the process itself, is actually getting these nuts in a workable place. So let's try one more time. Put that up there. Take another piece of masking tape. And there we go. There we go. See, now it's stuck up front, so you tilt it back, it doesn't fall right away. Let's try that and see if that's any better. So we will slip that on. And use our light. Now there's actually small divots to guide you where you need to put things, so keep that in mind if you're not sure where to actually and then we drop it, which is always fun. We'll take care of that later. Let's torque them in a not so appeasing way. So we'll do middle next. Here, and we'll torque. Let's torque middle. Now I have my my torque set relatively low, so that's why you hear it hitting torque constantly. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to go too crazy because it will pull the threads out. So let's try this one more time. This one's a little bit easier to get to. I'm going to put this on my head. This one's a little bit easier to get to because you can actually get your hand in a spot to put it in. I'm still going to go ahead and use some tape just for the sake of ease and to show you guys that it is possible. I'm not just making things up as I go. Or I try not to, at least. So again, make sure that's in there. There we go. And we'll take it and we'll slip it this way. There we go. Don't drop a bunch of shit, because that's never fun. So we'll torque this guy. Come back out. Now, if you guys did a carbon cleaning, chances are your motor's gonna run like shit the first time you start it up. So don't automatically attribute it to a vacuum leak. Just keep that in mind as well. But it was always good to check to make sure you didn't go crazy with anything. So Alright, now that that's on, we'll go ahead and we will pull this line out of the way and put the high pressure fuel pump back in place. Reconnect the brake booster hose, which is here. Set the cam follower in. Set the check valve back in place, which is there. Be careful not to tear this because that's an expensive little hose. I haven't needed to replace it yet, luckily, but I have run into a situation where someone asked me a part number, I looked it up, and I was like, oh, that's okay. So keep that in mind as well. So reattach intake flap motor harness over here. Might need to use a screwdriver to push it in place. Now the intake flap motor is what is responsible for opening up those little flaps that I said that I cleaned off in the intake. When you clean those, or when your motor starts, they close and open a certain way that is claimed to reduce emissions. So that's why those are there. You can actually buy a delete kit for those. APR sells their own delete kit. So keep that in mind. Word on the street is that you need a tune in order to utilize it. So just keep that in mind. Next, we'll go ahead and we'll install the bolts for the high pressure fuel pump. There are 3 of them. For the third one, you will need to use a 13 millimeter, wherever that, oh, you know what, I think the motor ate that. You'll need to use a 13, oh, there it is, millimeter socket to remove the pressure relief valve on the high pressure fuel pump. Loosen that up, pull that out, and set it aside. Keep in mind when you take this off initially, you'll need to relieve the pressure by taking a little screwdriver and pressing that with a rag underneath. Okay, so we'll line this up. Alright, now that's back in place. I'm going to plug in the sensors for the fuel pressure. And then there is the plug for the N80 valve, or I think, yeah, the N80 valve down here. So get that done, get that done. Fuel lines will be put back on here. Let's reattach the fuel lines. Again, a little bit of oil might help to reattach, just like that. Line on. Line on. This sits out of the way. This actually sits behind this. And technically underneath that. But okay. Good. And this clips on here. Then we'll take the pressure relief valve, which I set over here, and we'll put it back in. Now this needs to be snug. It needs to make a good seal, otherwise you're going to run into issues with the pressure relief leaking, which you do not want. So make sure it's snug but not over tight. Again, I'll try to source the torque specs for everything and post it so everyone has it and they're not ripping threads and shit out. Okay, so you should put a hose clamp on the end. I have one somewhere which I'll take care of in due time, but until then I'll leave that undid. Now this is a kind of annoying process. The throttle body pipe and the throttle body itself need to be aligned and then set on. I've always found this thing to be a real pain in the ass. So first we'll loosen up the hose clamp. Now if for whatever reason it's not fitting on right, chances are you'll need to loosen the bottom one. If yours slipped off, you'll need to loosen the bottom one and then just kind of put it back where it goes correctly. If you ever have a vacuum leak or hissing when you're in boost, it's very, very likely that this is the cause of it. So keep that in mind if you're ever searching for some vacuum leaks or whatever. Let's loosen that up a little. I actually have, and this looks a little bit different than your motor if you don't know what it is. I have a Tiguan throttle body pipe, and what that does is eliminates the throttle body hose, which runs back to this. So that's why that looks a little bit different, and I won't be installing it in this process. I do have one that I have a forged supersized valve to put on. That's part of the, who made that relocation kit? Somebody did. Someone made that relocation kit. I just don't remember who. I want to say it was BSH that included the forged supersize. Go. A little bit of strength to pull it up as it's snug in there. Again, you need to make a good seal with this. It's not really a if and or but thing, because if you don't make a seal, you're going to be not happy when you go to use it and there's issues. Let's get our piece of cardboard down. And at this point I'm going to get under the car and just push up. And hope that did the trick. If not, then, yeah, of course not. There we go. And there we go. Take your big ass screwdriver, tighten everything up. Make sure that you put your plugs back in for your throttle body. You will also need to prime the fuel pump with a couple key cycles before starting it. So as long as you do that, you should be good to go when you actually start the car. So keep that in mind too. I know it's a lot to consider and think about, but if you're wondering why your car is not starting, just make sure you give it a couple key cycles before assuming the worst, whatever the worst might be. Okay, that one last plug. So those are good. We'll need to tighten this. Try to loosen it at some point, or tighten it at some point to keep it from falling off, so we'll loosen it. Over. And I still need to crawl under the car and find that other 10mm nut that I dropped. Again, if you dropped one too, it's a 10mm M6x1 nut. And these guys need to be just thrown on, so I'm not too worried about that. I will take care of that though, because I have those up here. But for the sake of everything, everything's reassembled, good to go, and at this point you can try to start your car. So let's go ahead and do that. With no leaking at this point. Check to make sure everything's tight. I see a little bit of wetness around here, so I'm gonna tighten it, make sure vacuum's all good. You seem to be okay. I'll give it a couple rubs to make sure.